Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating and, honestly, a bit of a puzzle. We're talking about India's employment paradox. It's this crazy situation where you have a booming, rapidly growing economy, but then a really harsh reality when it comes to actual job security for the people driving that growth. It's a massive story about changing structures, deep-rooted issues, and some seriously eye-opening data. Let's get right into it. To really wrap our heads around this paradox, we literally have to start with one staggering number: 93%. Just think about that for a second. Despite all this massive economic growth over the last 20 years, 93% of India's workforce is still stuck in the informal sector. They're actually producing roughly half of the country's entire GDP, but they're doing the whole shebang without basic job security, formal contracts, or any real social safety nets. No way around it. That's a massive deal. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the anatomy of the workforce, then check out the rise of informalization, tackle the whole jobless growth issue, do a quick reality check with the latest data, and finally wrap up with government intervention and MGNRGA. All right, Section 1, Anatomy of the Workforce, unpacking the 40 crore workers. To really grasp what's going on in the Indian labor market, we got to start with the sheer scale of it all. We're talking about nearly 40 crore. That's 400 million people. But to even make sense of a number that huge, we need to get our basic definitions straight. Okay, so the crucial thing here is understanding the difference between two specific terms. First, we have the labor force. This includes everyone who is actually working, plus the folks who are actively looking and willing to work. Then you've got the workforce. This one only counts the people currently engaged in productive activities, the ones actually contributing to the gross national product right now. And the gap between those two groups, well, that's exactly where unemployment lives. Now, when you break down the demographics of those 40 crore workers, the distribution is, frankly, super skewed. You'll notice right away that roughly 70% of this workforce is male, and about 70% is based out in rural areas. When you zoom out and look at the big picture, the overall worker population ratio for the whole country is just 39.2%. So what does that actually mean? Basically, a surprisingly low percentage of the total population is formally engaged in recognized production activities. And this workforce distribution plays out totally differently depending on where you happen to be. Out in rural areas, a whopping 54% of workers are self-employed, usually working on family farms. Contrast that with urban centers, which rely way more on hired labor. And the gender divide? It's just as stark. Women rely incredibly heavily on self-employment, sitting at about 53%. You might be wondering why. Well, it's largely due to lower mobility, which basically forces women to find or create work much closer to home. Moving right along to Section 2, the rise of informalization, a structural shift. In a typical developing economy, you'd usually expect to see workers moving in a pretty straight line from farms straight into secure factory jobs. But as we'll see, India is experiencing a completely different kind of structural shift. Let's contrast these two very different worlds. On one side, we have the formal sector. This includes public enterprises and private firms with 10 or more workers. We're talking formal contracts, fixed salaries, social security benefits, the whole 9 yards. On the flip side is the informal sector, which is basically everything else. It's millions of farmers, small business owners, and self-employed folks with zero hired workers. In this world, workers can be dismissed without a single dime of compensation, and there's absolutely no protective regulation. It's tough out there. So it begs the question, why is the informal sector swallowing up 93% of the entire workforce? Honestly, it's a perfect storm. You've got restrictive labor laws, like the 1947 Industrial Disputes Act, which actually requires state permission to lay off workers in larger firms. That pushes industries to rely heavily on short-term contracts just to stay flexible. Combine that with low literacy rates, the lack of a universal employment code, and the fallout from global economic crises, and the formal sector just naturally shrinks. Oh, and the 2020 pandemic? That was a massive catalyst. In 2019 alone, an estimated 34% of permanently salaried people were forced into self-employment. That's a huge disruption. If we track this historically over 4 decades, from 1972 all the way to 2010, there is a massive, undeniable shift away from agriculture. It dropped from 74% of the workforce down to 53%. But here is the critical part. Instead of transitioning into nice, regular, salaried roles, all that labor increasingly moved toward casual wage work. This relentless, decades-long shift, that is the absolute core of what economists call the casualization of the workforce. Which brings us to Section 3, jobless growth and unemployment, the myth of entrepreneurship. We hear it all the time, right? That high economic growth naturally creates jobs, and that tons of self-employment must mean a booming culture of entrepreneurship. Well, our sources suggest we might need to totally rethink both of those assumptions. When you track GDP against employment growth, starting way back in the 1950s up into the 2000s, a glaring divergence suddenly appears in the late 1990s. Look at India's GDP. It's this solid, upward trend, growing rapidly and churning out exponentially more goods and services. But then look at the employment growth rate. It practically flatlined at around 2%. This right here is the textbook definition of jobless growth. The economic engine is absolutely roaring, but unfortunately, it's leaving the workers behind. And here's another wrinkle. Even when people appear to be working, it doesn't necessarily mean they're truly employed in a strict economic sense. This brings us to a massive rural issue known as disguised unemployment. This happens when the marginal physical productivity of labor is literally zero. Let me paint a picture for you. Imagine a small family farm that realistically only needs 3 people to run it. But because there are no other jobs around, 5 family members are out there working the land. Those extra 2 people are technically employed on paper, but they are adding exactly 0 real output to the farm. Now, what about all that self-employment we were just talking about? The reality on the ground is highly gendered. While self-employed men are largely what we call own-account workers, meaning they're running their own small enterprises, the data tells a very different story for women. Self-employed women are predominantly categorized merely as helpers in household enterprises. In practical terms, this usually means they have absolutely 0 independent earnings and are working less than 40 hours a week. At that point, it's not really entrepreneurship, it's underemployment. Okay, let's pivot to Section 4, reality check. Latest data from 2025 and 2026. Are things actually improving? Let's dig into the absolute latest, most granular data we have. So, the 2025 Periodic Labor Force Survey annual report actually threw us some modest but definitely positive structural shifts. The total share of agriculture dropped from about 45% down to 43%, while the manufacturing sector actually saw a bump in worker participation, hitting 12.5%. On top of that, the overall share of self-employment dropped just a bit to 56.2%, and this was accompanied by a slight rise in regular salaried employment, ticking up to 23.6%. So what does this tell us? It suggests a slight cooling off in that massive trend of informalization we talked about earlier. However, and it's a big however, if we look at the monthly macro indicators from March 2026, we start to see that positive momentum fading out. The overall unemployment rate crept right back up to 5.1%. And youth unemployment, that's sitting at a highly concerning 15.2%. Even more worryingly, both the labor force participation rate and the worker population ratio saw slight declines from February to March. This kind of divergence from the positive annual trend is a huge red flag that the labor market remains highly, highly volatile, which leads us perfectly into Section 5, Government Intervention and MGREGA. Given all this volatility and the sheer massive size of the informal sector, how is the state actually responding to all this? Since true formalization is still proving incredibly elusive, the government's focus has naturally shifted toward weaving a safety net for these vulnerable workers. And the crown jewel of this entire effort is MGNRGA. Launched back in 2006, it basically promises 100 days of guaranteed wage employment to rural households. Now, the ripple effects of this policy are absolutely fascinating. It didn't just hand out income, it actively drove up agricultural wages and noticeably shrank the wage gap between men and women. But ironically, by tightening the labor market so successfully, it ended up creating severe labor shortages for private farms. And what did that do? It basically forced them to accelerate mechanization. Talk about unintended consequences. And more recently, we've seen the government turning heavily to technology with the eShram portal. This is a massive, ambitious initiative to create the very first national Aadhaar-verified database specifically for unorganized migrant and gig workers. The ultimate goal here is to digitally track occupation and skill types. Why? So that targeted social security schemes can actually reach the folks operating in the informal economy. It's essentially trying to build a modern digital safety net where traditional formal employment has totally failed. Which leaves us with a pretty profound question to chew on as we wrap up today's explainer. We've looked at the sheer scale of the workforce, the historical drivers pushing casualization, and that massive stubborn gap between GDP growth and real job creation. With 93% of workers still operating entirely outside the traditional safety net, we really have to ask ourselves, in a rapidly growing, modernized economy, is achieving widespread traditional formalization even possible anymore? Or is the future of work inherently informal, requiring us to invent entirely new definitions of job security? It's a lot to think about. Thanks so much for exploring this paradox with me, and definitely keep questioning the numbers behind the narrative.